Hello everyone, today we talk about the 14th century crisis and the especially following development of European socio-economical situation. It's an interesting topic that we have addressed at this point multiple times, not often in the last year where most of my subscribers, gathered. This pertains mostly to the early phase of Schwerpunkt, and still there is a lot there. I created medieval society playlist that deals with that, not specifically. I think I created something about medieval peasantry, especially interesting for looking at the revolts that, as you know, in the from the mid 14th century began to break out. In fact, because of the repression followed to the crisis and the fact these upheavals. It's a very wide historiographical question because, as we'll see today, there are different approaches to a period in history that starts becoming really very complex, too complex, as a matter of fact, to be framed kind of unitarily, also for the expertise of a single scholar. You know that I'm not a specialist in history of economics, not even properly on social history per se. So I happen actually to specialize in the first half of the 14th century. It is a bit of a hybrid situation that probably is the most underrated to explain even the causes mostly of the crisis, the contraction. The historiography here stretches from, let's say, the comprehensive, let's say, interpretations of why the whole thing happened, to, let's say, the most minute details that, of course, separate you, distract you from the broader picture, so that if you want to answer the question, you have, of course, to look at everything in theory, but also you can't quite know everything, so how can you sum up the whole thing? And this is a problem basically of all, in fact, more recent history in general, right? If you start having this problem from the 14th century, you can imagine the wild, complexity of framing correctly from a historical point of view any better, say, of course, better documentation helps, but again, in terms of size, properly, the amount of sources and the capacity of connecting them, that complexity increases in the system. So it's terrifying, right? That's why, as medievalists, we joke about contemporaneous that we don't even consider them as historians anymore, by a certain degree, and or at least would criticize even this problem of the this is not, we don't do it as medievalists, that's just what I do, right? I always criticize hyper specialization because it lacks this even really attitude and habitude to the interest of explaining the broader phenomenon per se. Let's say that up to the 13th century you're able in a lifetime to cover basically all the sources of the period if you really study really hard, which it's already a gigantic enterprise, not really meaning that a person can cover all the sources of the 13th century, even if it were just Europe, or sometimes even if it were just an entire country. And this is mostly also for the documentary aspect, that if you're not an archaeologist, then other things can be complex and difficult. But let's say up to that time you can at least have a broader, you can be familiar with sources and in a decent fashion. Even for early medieval times, you can read a single source hundreds of times, and each time you will find something different, right? A different perspective on it. You notice something you didn't notice before, have other ideas, and so on. So history in this is really infinite. By the 14th century, you start having such a huge documentary production that it becomes, in fact, de facto impossible to and hope to have, in the mental capacities to frame uniformly and comprehensively everything, right? So this produces concrete problems of interpretation. You see, you would think the historian is somebody who just proceeds by, there is a field of expertise, and so he or she knows good, say that well that specific field, and you would expect, the other scholars to do the same, and therefore to produce altogether, an historiography with studies that are reliable, so that you can simply, by quoting somebody else's study, say, okay, well, more or less that's the correct version of the story, and we all know that, in fact, it's not quite the case. But it's not just caprice, let's say, of peakiness or whatever you want to call it. It's just that factually some broader interpretations in general, or at least the fact that everything has become so compartmentalized and diversified and hyper-specialistic, that, let's say, brings these studies to be detached from the comprehensive perspective as well. So they can be done very well in detail, right, from the bottom up, let's say, but they're hardly, calibrated for being understood correctly, or to even have been understood correctly by the same authors sometimes in a broader context. It's an extremely complicated thing. I can just tell you that from a historian perspective, what you feel is basically you freak out all the time, because you realize that you could, first of all, you're a mortal, so you don't have the time to cover all this information satisfactorily, that nobody ever came up with a satisfactory capacity, in fact, to frame them all in a coherent and scientific fashion that you can say, well, this is basically what correct history is. And so and you can just think it to a limited amount of things. Like, you can read hundreds of sources and more, but let's say, first of all, you're not going to remember them all. Secondly, it depends also on the degree of depth you go in them, and so you're basically become aware of the vastity of the material, and you find yourself ever smaller in front of it, and therefore you say, how the hell can I even do or say something, or relevant, or at least positive and practically applicable, in front of all this thing. It's also true that as humans, of course, we are endowed with a dramatic synthesis capacities that, as much as our brain in our life is concerned, we know virtually nothing of how it really happens even. So that we have a particular sensitivity when it comes to, in fact, data that is human enough, like studying political, military, and social events, to the point that, of course, not that you fix the problem by yourself, but at least you're able to relate in ways that give you an idea of how things could have gone. And the more you study, paradoxically, it's not much that you feel that disoriented, but on the contrary, you start feeling ever more secure of, let's say, of how coherent, after all, history is, because that's the beauty of history. It's not created out of scratch, right? It's based on what has been left of reality. So reality is out of your control in many ways, and especially the past one, when you were not even born, and most of the, in fact, of everything in the first place, because it's not that you mold the world at your image, and that's what we're trying to do on Schwerpunkt, I can tell, but that's another thing. Not really, it's just a distasteful joke. But what I concretely mean is that, yes, there is a capacity to assimilate in this, to be confronted with the fact that reality is real, and so it tells us stories that make sense, because they were not invented by a single faulty mind. That's why I detest fantasy as a genre in the first place, or why I think that people should never substitute history with fiction, even for the sake of learning history better, albeit that's also kind of unavoidable, and we also make all a fiction, right? There is something fictional about history in the moment we make it, right? In the moment, we write it, and that's always the problem we were saying before, but at the same time, reality confirms itself in front of it even, and so the problem is partially resolved, and of course we gain some impression and understanding that we should evaluate. And of course, in front of this topic of how fundamentally what did really change from the 14th century and what was just like the 15th as a consequence is one of those topics that I have no problem saying that they haven't quite understood, right? There are some things they have understood, some things especially that I've seen in the making of this, in the paving of to the to the crisis itself of what we think in fact as a big crack. I have developed mostly the idea that the crisis was actively produced, that it didn't fall out of some, it was not brought by the plague in itself, it was the bigger crack, etc., but it was factually created, mostly through an exhaustion of resources themselves, right? It's not that at some point resources were stopped from a moment to another. They simply were destroyed to the point that this delicate pre-industrial systems could not fundamentally bring to regrow anymore by a certain degree. But still, there were also certain big waves, such as the ones brought by the plague, that were instead, kind of more external influences. Some people say also what it was a cold climate and so on. I personally think that it's human beings that know how to perfectly mess up their lives much better than any weather change or pandemics and so on, and that these things just complicate the situation, but the situation is already very complicated and somewhat always changing, right? Another bias that we mature when we want to explain the bigger picture is that as if there were some basis that we give for granted, some macroscopical factors or dynamics that more or less we reduced to some simple equation, and then these things were brutally destroyed for some reason, and then we find it a problem of why this is the case, and we often underestimate how, first of all, much more complex, but also how easy to modify these dynamics were, even assuming that largely they were correct, right? We see what is extraordinary in the sense of history is that we see pretty precise things. Like that picture of mess and of unknown that we traced before actually is not so discomforting when you read the sources, because the sources actually give you a great confidence. They say extremely intelligent things. They are basically telling you how it's gone. It's just that we're not tuned with them in adequately to just be humble and listen better to what they're telling us. And so that doesn't make things necessarily that easier, but at the same time it reveals in a way how those humans were reacting to the situation, given that they were fundamentally also the actors of those same changes. Excuse me, I drink a little. So for our next cycle of topics, I think we can start, in fact, with this. Paradoxically, we start from the end, right? We should make this video at the end of the whole thing, but let's say it's important also to frame the problem for explaining eventually the causes or the dynamics and how it happened. So if you have followed my channel from some time and you're more interested in the socio-economical side of the story, you know that I have described the Middle Ages as this, at least from the 10th, but even before, that this great, expansion, right, of medieval Europe that is quite there, unavoidably. It's something that, of course, we notice more sharply in Western Europe, and it's something that, in fact, is such one of those other enormous topics that never end, and so we will probably move while also to the early Middle Ages in one of these videos if I continue making. But to maybe explain that, and then eventually, especially between the 10th and the 13th century, this is literal boom, right, of a civilization that we haven't even been able to describe, because in this tumultuous growth, let's say, the institutions, the structure, we were not there. That's why we insist so much on the civilizational role of the elites, etc., and how the thing was done, because nothing was given for granted. It's just that this overexpansion brought at some point, for reasons that I tell you, I think are mostly internal, in the guise of literal distractions, right? Properly prolonged wars especially. And I could document certain things for some regions that I studied specifically that are very eloquent in that regard, that make you realize it's that easy, right? You don't even have to bring many other factors in, or at least you understand how they blend in the system perfectly. And then by the mid 14th century, roughly, by the crisis, the recession even kicked in, let's say from the late 13th century. The system it stalled at some point and then eventually imploded by the mid 14th century, and we see the plague as essentially the marker there, as the watershed. And indeed, that is true. I believe that had a great impact, but again, I think the system was already sensibly weakened, so for it to make an ever more, let's say, impacting change in this situation. So what also we have seen is that, paradoxically, differently from late antiquity, when Justinian's plague, etc., brought to that change, that that contraction that we call the Dark Ages, is also very debatable. There are huge historiographical nuisances. Again, we can't digress on it temporarily now, but let's say at least there we see that literally a world change concretely. There was an important contraction and regression and deterioration. And so there was probably a big, there was a real collapse by a certain degree. Even in there, it was not probably so sudden as we think. It was, even in my opinion, in that case, being paved, let's say, before to be reached. And anyhow, something deeply changed at the right in many ways, because the primitive world was that things reverted to was much more easy to modify at that point than a much larger system that would have also a cultural resistance on its own. What happens in the Middle Ages is actually that what we see as the Renaissance is actually a medieval product, in fact, of a civilization that received a very heavy blow, but that was incredibly resistant, right? Once I made a video that was about the resilience of medieval civilization, and I think it was correct if you consider the broader Middle Ages as such, but I think for this latter period, it's not even that, right? It's not that Europe seems, in spite of this terrific blow, to have lost it at some point, or to have, let's say, feared for this system to entirely collapse. There was none of this. The system backed up itself in ways that, as we'll see now, reorganized the whole thing, but that lived on, right? And not only, but kept developing. And even though, especially the material side of the story shows us that, and this is also part of the debate, that, we don't know. So there are some people who say, the system actually began to produce even more than before, even during the crisis. And this is one of those fields, first of all, in which I cannot venture because I don't have the specific expertise, but it's been, at least the major scholars of the period have proposed this, and now we'll explain how and why. And that shows us the incredible strength of the whole system, and how, in fact, this thing went on. In fact, when I studied the plague and so on, because I worked a lot on chronicles, and so I could see the stories, linearly speaking, many stories, so similar between one another in broader political, social interest and so on, that normally registers, especially in the first half of the 14th century, all these disasters that began to happen apparently at the time, and that you would expect when the plague arrived that this would have been such a big deal. And of course, yes, it's a big deal, but if you read it in that perspective, it seems that it was kind of a bigger deal than the usual, but not something unusual per se, right? You would expect the plague, but actually what happens when those chronicles tell the story is that, there is a big paragraph on the plague, and then the chronicle of the major political military events goes on without any, not saying, well, because of the plague this thing had gone. No, they don't see it, they don't explain it to you in that way. So you understand that there is a much greater continuity than we have probably postulated, that there is indeed an enormous change at some point from a moral point of view, that it is a bit typical of the late Middle Ages. You see it in everything, in art, in properly in the way people related to death, to to spirituality in the first place. So there is something there that is connected to the broader, to this long and powerful social, economical, and spiritual fever that had really messed up 14th century European society, or at least changed it deeply in many ways. And that's still, in fact, I believe we underestimate also in the political military side of the story, because these topics are mostly the greatest, the most fertile soil for all those kind of materialistic historiography, mostly of Marxist inspiration, that dwelled into the socio-economical, as if everything was socio-economical historically, and in fact the most important things are political and military and social together. The economic side is just within the social, in a sense. So we have, in many ways, told history in ways that are disgustingly shifted towards historical materialism, and had radically damaged the whole historical understanding of that we have in the world, because this was a Western thing, and basically outside of it there is no other kind of historical understanding, scientifically speaking. And so we have generated this idea that you can explain that just it's just all a mechanism, right? It's about money, it's about resources. It's not about what people thought they did, right? And they kept doing, by the way, in ways that were ever more ferocious, and of course were connected to socio-economical aspects. Right now, we maybe resumed a little bit, at least the spiritual one, because art and iconography are always there, etc. But this lack of comprehensivity of the main issues that are always primarily political, because that's what people do at the end, they decide to do, even when they are in shortage of resources, and especially when they are in shortage of resources, it actually make the difference in the most important way. At least that's something that we don't necessarily like. And the reason why the studies have flourished also is because of from the socio-economical perspective, is of course because there is more data available. So those things that normally you don't know for the High Middle Ages, because we basically know almost nothing of how really economy worked. At this point, are there. You can study them in detail, etc. At least, especially for certain areas of Europe and so on. So, but it doesn't mean that there was a huge job being done to again reconduct the thing towards a more holistic kind of approach. In any case, these are just this is just criticism as such, but it's unavoidable when you touch this topic, because again, that's the entire problem. That is, what are we even talking about? We don't know still. In any case, what is being spotted, in fact, and by already from the 19th century historiography, that was very often quite more insightful in many ways than we're willing to realize, is that there was indeed, in spite of this long wave of depression of some sort, an important answer from the side of the ruling classes. Right, the word didn't stay there just taking it. There was a change. There were big changes. There were big struggles. There were new balances that were created fundamentally, but through, also, in fact, revolts, brutal repressions, etc. Fundamentally, what we see as the old regime, the ancien regime here, it was born. Right, what of most of we think the previous Middle Ages were, as a matter of fact, were created at this point, and you can apply them for most of the, especially the early modern age, rather than the Middle Ages per se. This could be defined, this process, as a broader economical and productive readjustment, in which the concentration, especially of landed assets, in a lesser amount of hands, and therefore the numerical reduction of small property, especially the agricultural one, as you understand, was still the base, of course, pre-industrial society, is just one side of the story. Again, you can measure that, but you have to explain how it happened and why it happened, and what people were actually doing at the time. for make it happen. We never talked maybe in detail about them, but you know that there were these great banking, let's say financially bankrupt. There were great bankrupts that followed like in a domino effect in the 40s of the 14th century. This started, famously enough, mostly from the Italian banks, properly the Tuscan Angevin axis, what had been during the 13th century essentially the successful one, like the peak that had peaked, in fact, this kind of medieval civilization in terms of basically everything, right? In terms properly of civil production, of development, economics, art, administration, everything, right? State. And this system reflected, of course, this tumultuous growth that at the time was unchecked. Like banks were developed in a quite speedy fashion, were extremely effective and efficient and functional for this moment of great growth. And just that nobody had ever witnessed such brusque halting, right? Even about those collapses were, there is a huge historiographical debate, but not even here we can really digress on. Initially, it was thought it was mostly about even there, it didn't even necessarily have to happen. This is important to stress. It was not just because of the monarchies didn't pay their loans. It was mostly a crisis within the same banking system. And the same banking houses learned to provide themselves with more flexible structures, right? This also in the history of capitalism, that was an important step forward. Let's say they operated in such fashion that the failure of some branch wouldn't entail the collapse of the entire system. This is a process that goes also beyond banking. As we will see, this was properly about the same investments, because also these banks had made their success because of private investment, right? And so the coming back to the land asset, for example, was one of the major features of this phase, notoriously. And so even from a political point of view, in spite of the crisis, what you see in later medieval Europe, there is a recompacting of the territorial assets. There are the collapses of the great universal systems that were kind of floating over these enormous resources that, as soon as contracted financially wise, brought unavoidably princes to, let's say, focus mostly on a local base or on a national base, or at least on a regional base of some sort. And this is particularly evident. We made a series of videos about the process of secularization, the decline of the great universal powers, the empire, the papacy, and so the rise of the let's say at least the consolidation further of the national monarchies. You can even argue that most of what we see in Europe today in terms of political map is fundamentally the consequence of this phase in some way. It's a big word, right? Of course, even 500 years before you can't see that, or 500 years later, let's say it changes. But let's say this idea that Europe was essentially a patchwork of some consistent provincial, regional entities that eventually built up to go into properly the nation states that we know in half of a millennium later, kind of originated from this time. This seemingly favored properly the fragmentation of the world system, because originally the plan was to create a big universal empire, right? This in Europe was probably impossible to do, right? This was possible just in countries like, the Byzantine Empire had achieved that. It was being a prerogative of the caliphs in the early, this great centralized states of Roman-Hellenistic tradition that had dwelled like as the major powers up to the High Middle Ages fundamentally, and then instead this system collapsed definitely, and Europe never was enforced. Let's say, on the contrary, a great part of the success of Western Europe was owed to the fact that probably there was not such an hegemonic empire that could deplete resources, say waste more resources systemically than before. Europe was not really also the best continent proper to to carry out such a thing. It was very diversified, but still was dramatically interconnected. So this conferred to the West some characteristics that were basically unknown historically, and especially at this point, what you see as a sort of kind of Western superiority was already there. At least in potential, you could see it. And part of this also was, if you think about the Ottoman advance later on, other issues, etc., that this political fragmentation paradoxically was more useful to favor the savings of the great assets, because they managed to shift this capital. So through a much more refined banking system from one country to another, it was a great interconnection in there. So, and nobody could really take over this whole system. It was too big, right? The Ottomans concretely never could inspire to people say, to arrive to the Thames, right? And so there is this yet another topic, but again, the idea that these states began to kind of concentrate further, even under some important pressure, because they were interdependent of one another, right? It wasn't even about external threat. It was about the fact that it could be sold out by one another in the process, right? And so they tried to. This brought to an incredible development. What we know. Think about diplomacy at this time. The same banking. The creation also some international code of system of values of scientific. Think about humanism. That was a truly European thing, right? It was not just one nation or another. It was truly seen. In fact, that's what we named the Erasmus after. There was something at the core that was starting to become the West as we know it. It's just, of course, the system was still quite. It had to evolve importantly, but the crisis here brought to some consequences that also highlighted in a way what were that changed the great centers of production in many ways. Up to the mid 14th century, for example, the monopoly on textile production was held by the Flemish, right? Even in Tuscany, it was quite active in that craft. They contented themselves to essentially just perfect and dye the Flemish clothes, famously enough. By the mid 14th century, things changed, right? The biggest textile centers would become England, Holland, Italy, and this would remain as such. And they were also, what you see, indeed, in this period is properly industrial activities, we can say, that were spreading and based not anymore in the cities themselves, but in the countryside, where the labor force was more was meeker, let's say, and cheaper, right? These industries exploited especially the waterways, and they were in fact essentially working still at essentially textile, metallurgic, and paper production activities. This change is important because in moments of crisis historically, first of all, what you see here is that there are historically centers that were already somewhere. You see the shift in the production centers is sometimes not just because of the amount of wealth accumulated. Like England and Holland historically were not among the most dramatically developed countries in Europe, and instead, for reasons were in fact primarily political, also the textile center production shifted towards those areas. Italy also was already well launched in that sense and kind of consolidated further, and that's a case in which probably also the capitals helped dramatically to invest with a very rich elite at a local base. In times of crisis, there is usually technological advancement because, of course, resources become more costly, and this means that in a way you want to waste the least of them, right? And yet in a moment of crisis, those who have more money in this sense, who have more means, are also the ones who can fundamentally invest in the new labor force changes. And at this point, being the only ones who had the capitals, in part, there could be a latifundium, of course, that says, at that point that was still somewhat remunerative, but at the same time, the creation of these more oligarchic systems stimulated specialized and higher quality production, right, for those same elites, right, and a greater coordination between these areas of Europe. The system did not stop in that sense, right? It was, yes, a financial crisis, but the idea that the system was interconnected and kept happening that way, kept developing in that direction, is still meaningful, because there was a refeudalization of the system, and this brought the elites to become paradoxically more international at that time than they had been before. And this gave opportunity to new possibilities of political and social coordination that had been possible before, because before, it was a total mess, right? There was an establishment which other communities were starting to, in part, even to challenge, etc., and that contributed to the instability of the system, albeit it was keeping to grow. And so, in many ways, as I was saying before, the system had to be settled in a way or another through war, right? And so, also what you see in the process is that the same people accepted that, not much just because they were depleted that were exhausted by all these wars and needed stability before anything else, but probably because there was a rationalization, a stabilization, and in this sense, probably a sense of security was needed by everybody, right, to maintain things more stable, because before it hadn't been the case. As long as resources kept coming, that was possible. You have ever more resources thrown in the system. At this point, there are not. And so changes are also tend to be more permanent in a way, and you risk more. So you prefer not to dare that much and to consolidate locally. And this local consolidation to bring also to a more structured socio-economical system. By the way, as we'll see now, there are also changes in the major routes, right? Part of the reason why the Flemish markets declined is the not just war, because that happened as well, but also the same, also war. I meant, because I was thinking about the French invasion of Flanders, but also properly the 100 Years' War that in part were connected, as you know, and the crisis of the Champagne fairs and the great English chevauchée in France. And so the actual collapse of the French state and the interruption of that great axis that had basically been from Flanders, Champagne fairs, Rhone Valley, Mediterranean, to the creation of other routes, right? The Genoese opening the Atlantic one, the Venetians opening the Alpine one with Germany. For example, the development of Bavaria in the process, other powers that were taking the place of this previous actors, let's say, in what had been some of the most productive regions, such as Provence, etc. That, however, at this time faced an important moment of crisis. There were massive distractions, properly. So never underestimate that. It's not strange, right? It's something that, because war really destroyed stuff, and by the 14th century, war was all over. Like not just because it's not much that they made less. They actually started making war less than before. Paradoxically, it's just in terms of absolute force, because that was literally exhausted. It's as if you could see, if you study the thing in progression, you see armies shrank. There was a regression even in the art of war. This is not really conceived, because normally you have always been said, well, there was actually an improvement in the art of war. Not quite. I mean, it took a while. Of course, there was an improvement in the form of more permanent systems, say, maintaining, as we were saying before, this greater core of troops. For example, the semi-permanent or fully permanent armies that began as small ones, etc., but to evolve basically what would become the modern armies. This does begin here, but they're smaller armies than you imagine. They're not particularly, they don't have that exuberant force of development of let's say, of an actual combined armed tactics with particular, strength. It's even a more primitive way of making war. Firearms also increase this paradoxically position warfare more than it had been the case before, because you would imagine that artillery would actually raise initially fortresses to the ground. Not really, because artillery wasn't quite even substituted entirely by the previous artillery, but initially this brought actually to a greater entrenchment than it had been the case before. And this more in general derives from those political and social situations we were saying before. If say resources were more compacted under the elites, what you see is that there is also a greater process of fortification. Not much because of course also artillery was around, so they wanted to build larger fortresses, and so something that consolidated even a greater control on the territory, but properly because they needed to prevent ever more coups that were, by the way, the way before sieges, the way to actually enter in possession of fortifications and so on. So there are very interesting things that change, are really counterintuitive in practice. But the big armies of tens of thousands of troops that were not even something so exceptional, like up to the 13th century, that had been the peak of them. But if the 14th century, maybe it's not a massive shrinking in terms of what you could bring on the field, because again the structure was imposing, but it's the frequency of their employment en masse that is reduced. Right, there are certain areas that up to the mid 14th century made war continuously. Then you see that they're properly exhausted. You don't even count properly. The way of describing war ceases in part to be even as effective as before, because it's also social, because these humanists were not anymore those who actually made war like before. But and I know that to some of you it's strange to think that did people who went at war before actually write about history? Actually they did, right? Especially in the form when they were more politically involved or socially involved. At least they knew pretty well what was happening on battlefields. Later on, the humanist is somebody that watches things from the window, right? It's not really involved anymore in the project, because the prince rules and just a smaller entourage rules. So very often Renaissance battles are much less detailed than some medieval ones in practice, that explain things even paradoxically in a more rational way, in a less confused and scenographic way than what humanists did. Again, counterintuitive, but it did actually happen, and we have difficulties. And if you just see it quantitatively speaking, how many pitched battles you can actually find happening, right? You would say, but maybe it's because these people also wrote less about war properly. Well, not really, because we are ever better documented in the sense that there are ever more sources. So if a big war battle happened, in the first place, everybody kind of wrote about it. We know it happened. There is ever less mystery around that. We know it as an ever more real historical event. It's just that the way they describe it, we know they happen, and we can measure in that sense the fact that these bigger engagements diluted over time. You could have tens in some decades. In half a century, you had just a bunch, really. That by dimensionally to explain how the thing happened, and still states grew at that time. States compacted at that time. So that tells you how many resources had been exhausted, right? And or I'm not sure whether, I don't think they were not investing in that, because still the economy was not such for which people could just indefinitely save. There was a lot of investing, as a matter of fact, you'll see. So they weren't sparing resources either, right? The situation was still too unstable for affording that. It's not real, right? So that's not a factor you can interpret like that. Also, the agricultural redefinition is particularly important, with the reduction of spaces were destined to cereals, to the advantage of, say, industrial plants. Also, the textile manufacturing brought on the markets now not only woolen clothes, but also textiles of linen and hemp They were solicited also by a new fashion that that imposed shirts and underwears, etc. And also the demand of silk, we made a video about this last summer, increased importantly, while the glass manufacturing developed also in a decisive way. Now this is important because it shows first of all how the producers had shifted, as we've seen, from an important level of this production from the cities that were quite tumultuous places, or at least that had also they had witnessed such disturbances, especially in the greatest centers of production like Flanders and Italy, famously enough, and that for this reason were also less secure at some point, less safe, but it also had been struck by the plague more, right? The great cities, with a very few exceptions in Europe, had witnessed a very strong demographic drop, so much that medieval cities had only enlarged, just we know it, urbanistically speaking. They were, compared to the older city from Roman times, 1-2 walls to build because how much it had expanded. Well, population shrank in Europe to the point that mostly up to the 17th, but in some cases even up to the 19th century, European cities didn't come to be as populated as before, at least in the same space. So it's a dramatic change, and so it's obvious that at that point, even just that there were less people to work there. On the other hand, as we will see also in other pieces, we're already seeing the peasantry was gradually subordinated to the elites, and mostly they lost a great part of their autonomy. Right? They lost it after a fierce struggle, by the way, that however brought to their complete defeat. In the history of Europe, the peasantry could have won like a fourth state at some point, a place in the institutional and political representatives, but they didn't have properly the moral, especially, but before then the material capacities to do it. Right? The material capacities, they would have had it because they were the ones that were producing stuff, but they didn't know how to do anything because they were unaware themselves. They didn't have the means to just revolting because they were starving to death, and basically that's it, right? So even the Jacquerie was and the various peasant revolts, etc., at the end of the day didn't accomplish anything, and were brutally repressed, as they had brutally broken out. By the way, some of the greatest disasters, even historically destructions, etc., would be brought by these crowds that surely didn't have much of an idea of what would have been better for the community in the first place. They just knew that they were going down, so they were taking the whole thing back with them, but say down with them. But in any case, what the situation witnesses is that the cities, especially in spite of their demographic fall, become ever more important, paradoxically, in relative terms, because they become the great centers of coordination of these new territorial realities. Right? It's not just small castles anymore, seigneuries, etc. Now, Europe witnesses the rise of proper states that need cities, that need administration, and that need to extend on a fixed territory that very often overlaps with these important districts. The cities are the cornerstone of these dominations. They are also the centers that can provide, let's say, properly to monarchic movements or to princely movements that sense of monarchy, right, of unitarity, also the administrative personnel, the bureaucracy, the culture, the ideological means, etc., to maintain such domains. They're properly massive infrastructures, as they were walled at this point, they were ever more reinforced as such, and that's why also they increased their importance. And as a consequence, Europe had different speeds, right? Most of this collapse was causing Western Europe at this point. Some areas of Central Eastern Europe had this collapse mostly later. If you think about, for example, Bohemia, had its greatest collapse by the beginning of the 15th century. they lost 1/3 of their population. There was also a dramatic, regression in that regard. And the reason being that these countries were less connected to the broader, let's say international connections compared to Western Europe. In a sense, were more prepared as more primitive to that kind of blow that could arrive, but still, while the crisis brought to a recompaction of power in the West and to the evolution to a further, to state what we call a modern state, very often Central European monarchies witnessed at that time actually exactly because of this solid coming back on the land, the collapse of their process of state building, and actually transforming into elective monarchies where the rulers would have ever less power in that perspective, so that eventually that area of Europe remained kind of all these monarchies kind of fell one after another over time under some kind of foreign domination in the modern age, or at least they didn't have those same resources that the West at that point, through this oligarchization and rationalization of and centralization of power had managed to achieve, like in the bigger directions, as more unitary actors, of which, by the way, their entire communities benefited, because at the end of the day, yes, there was this great imbalance now created between the elite and the lower classes that had never been seen, but still, the broader improvement of these states brought to the increasing life quality for everybody in absolute terms over time. So that's basically the history of Europe in that regard. So it's being the same, just like with feudalism at the beginning, right? You may think it's something terrible and oppressive, but as a matter of fact, those were the states that progressed further in everything, including life quality, just by having this greater power at the top, that eventually from which the rest of society benefited on not even that long run, if you consider, after all, the speeds of the time, say the changes of the time. So there is and so cities become properly, in fact, the cornerstones of this greater monarchic or princely dominations, and they also are ever more internationally connected, right? At this time, in late medieval times, you have properly the creation of a broader system of exports and imports that are really international, right? There are the great, let's say, there are phenomena that arrive, I don't know, grain from Russia exported up to Portugal, right? These kind of things. So things that up to modern times, that these states would rely on, in a way, because there were bigger, dynamics that had already happened, in a way. The ports of the Baltic and the North Sea had acquired greater importance, for example. But in general, what is going on is properly that the states managed to coordinate better with one another. That's why also diplomacy increased, because there were kind of less and more powerful actors than before, thanks to this process of political and social compaction, right, under single rulers. And this is extraordinary, especially if you think, again, as we were saying before, how still thriving the system was, meaning that it was not a recompaction under only one ruler all over Europe. It was still a gradual process, right? But it managed to maintain its vitality exactly because of the interconnection with all these other states. You would expect, it had been so difficult to recompact politically Europe after, the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire and so on, and this great effort, you would think, would be lost, would have been useless in the moment of the big crisis that struck everybody. The system could have disgregated further. Instead, it did not. Interestingly enough, this is the moment in which Germany began to, yes, the national monarchy had failed, but still the princely houses managed to recompact important dominations. This is the moment in which the Italian city-states remained without emperor, without rule. You would expect to keep destroying one another without any construct and make the system collapse. No, the Italian regional states were formed. So what is interesting about these dynamics is that with the exception of, well, this may be seen in perspective, let's say that the capacity of waging war on a larger scale in foreign countries kind of decreased. You wouldn't think of that because you say, but what about the 100 Years' War? The English were always in France. Yes, but that was a particular situation. It was due mostly to the proximity, to the fact that France was huge, and being hit by this crisis, it was very easy to exploit it, so that the English were also a smaller country, but they were very surgical in their operations, right? And at the end of the day, they didn't manage to swallow the whole chunk, right? So that's still a part of the story. Let's say England and France threaten each other consistently by the 12th to 13th century in ways that are somewhat overlooked. But if you look at Spain too, the great phase of the Reconquista at this point is over, right? Mostly for the 2 last centuries in the Middle Ages, the political map of the Iberian Peninsula remains the same. Nobody invades Italy up to 1494, even though there are smaller expeditions, but it was mostly a political, international coordination with the local powers. It wasn't just a conquest. After all, Poland compacts in a way that, as you know, manages to connect with Lithuania, to drive the Teutonic Knights out, to reduce their power in the country. So the great Mongol invasions are kind of over. Yes, there is the Golden Horde there that always causes troubles in Russia, etc., and they have some projection capacity. But you see, even in Russia under Muscovy and the same Tartars, that the politically the territory is recompacted in a way. So also the Scandinavian monarchies kind of grow, in spite of all their difficulties, towards something more unitary and that can act also in a more coordinated way. Think about the Kalmar Union. So overall, also Scotland, for example, becomes a more consistent power on its own after the Wars of Independence. So there is this process of consolidation from which Europe benefited dramatically. And what is crucial to understand here is that this was wanted largely by the people. Right, when we see at the 14th century the great revolts of the salaried workers in Flanders, in Italy, or the Jacquerie in France, it was massive, right? But we underestimate, as in other times of crisis, how much the decisive moral force of the people actually stood from the idea of stabilization. People were tired of revolutions, were tired of wars, were tired of instability. They did not like this. You can read even the 100 Years' War like this. I mean, France was reduced to what? To Orleans at some point. And yet, so France not only won, but became, at the end of the period, the most powerful country in Europe. How would it have been possible if there hadn't been a consensus in the population, those who held the decisive moral strength of the country, to put that back together and looking at the advantages that derived from it, right? So you see crisis, but a great work of stabilization was bloody, right? There were lots of people sacrificed in the process, but the majority benefited dramatically from this stabilization. And also, as we've seen here, the production of more specialized products that were evidently for a higher market, for this elite that had consolidated further. We're talking mostly about the monarchs, the princes, the patriciate of the cities. So these elites that also kind of became more alike altogether. During Humanism, there is this process. You can see that the monarchs want to become a bit more like the urban elites, right? By this, cities are ever more important in their policies. The cities are the places where the most refined art and and fashion, etc., comes. Conversely, the patriciate of the cities marries into royalty. This is mostly look at the Italian Renaissance and what that exported, and what the political connections with the other monarchies were, and how there was this sense of humanism. In fact, people are confused sometimes. They think that humanism brought the revaluation of mankind in the sense of every people, maybe in a democratic sense. Not really, right? This was the face of most brutal consolidation of the hierarchies, right? It's just that at a higher level there was kind of a mutual understanding that between elites you could really understand each other, that you weren't really that different after all. We find glass, silk, right? This is luxury stuff. And yeah, so it seems thus that after the mid 14th century, European population, albeit diminished and impoverished, consumed complexively more than before. And this could derive from the fact that those who had initially, let's say, speculated mostly from this enormous growth, right? That already by the 13th century there was a very few democratic character to it anymore. There were still already the elites, the oligarchs had saved more, had capitalized more and invested less, paradoxically, in relative terms, to store. Whereas the crisis forced the system to develop further a more intense, constant investment that was functional, because even ostentating that luxury meant to make politics with it, to validate itself with it, to stabilize further with it, and naturally giving job to people, right? You cannot look at these elites, this splendid late medieval, Renaissance, early modern elites, and saying, these people were, parasites. The elites were giving work to everybody. Like you cannot look at the great capitals of the Renaissance, seeing all these churches, these palaces, and not realizing how many people lived, earned through those constructions, to those forever open building sites, right? This was particularly important. It was a clientery society that gave confidence, stability, security, opportunity, right? Naturally, the countryside was the most attached, like the one that kind of remained aside, that lost its political negotiation powers, that the cities themselves, of course, based their power on it, their surplus on it, became more culturally detached from, right? Also the internationalization of trade brought to that, to the idea that cities maybe knew better each other than they knew their own countryside, in relative terms, than before. And so a different culture properly necessitated the idea that somebody had to remain stably framed in that system in order to produce, because there was no other way to save the stability of the whole system otherwise, because somebody else could have taken over politically or militarily, and it would have been worse for everybody. So the volume of the traveling goods increased. Is also another important aspect, in part because it was in fact less, it was more regulated, right? Of course, those who were interested in these investments, as we've seen, were fewer people who had individually better means, and so this could provide for safer also means of production and transportation. The volume of the so-called poor goods increased, to see that these were consumed, that after all the people had some important material wealth, that that the system hadn't ruinously collapsed from that point of view. Wine, alimentary products in general, clothes increased, right? And it seems that this imposed, of course, the usage of new types of ships, of greater capacity and of with reinforced structure that could hold, right, also in the oceanic navigation, given that, as we were saying before, the ports on the Baltic and the North Sea, and also coming, to Mediterranean through the Atlantic coast in the west, had increased their importance, right? So also the routes were longer often. The increase in this single investments brought, of course, in the increase also of the reach, right? And so this boosted all the navigation techniques and all things. We made videos about this stuff and explain it. So the cargo ship, the oceanic cargo ship par excellence, the tall and large cog, was born, given that it was capable of transporting this large quantities of goods. And this brought to interesting developments also in naval warfare, because the stability provided by the ever greater mass of the ship could afford to mount up artillery, absorbing the recoil, right? It could not bother more than much the ship maneuverability and so on. So in front of these progresses in the field of trade and manufacture, the instruments of accounting and credit were developed and perfected. For example, the double entry or exchange letters and so on. And the surplus of these activities was in part spent or invested in land assets. In this way, in some European countries, and especially in Italy, a new entrepreneurial and ruling class was born, which was distinguished by, at this point, properly capitalistic features, right? That characteristics properly in face, but at the same time, it was leading a nobiliar lifestyle, right? And in part, in fact, marrying into families of the high feudal, the old feudal nobility, and rediscovering and reevaluating the nobiliar traditions. As we were saying before, there was this coming together of the patriciate, of the nobility of blood, and so on, in oligarchic sense, but still with this very innovative, modern, and quite, in fact, entrepreneurial. Think about the Medici dynasty that married into royalty, right, and pioneered banking in Europe and so on. So that these are the models, and there is, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, this is just to say to tell a bunch of the things that changed at the time. But it's obvious that this video isn't satisfactory per se, because, however, the problem of the overall evaluation of this age between the 14th and the 15th century was hotly debated already starting from the 19th, exactly because of this, how it happened, right? Is it true everywhere, like how it is? Let's say that over time we can approximate wildly, saying that there are two different schools of thought opposed to one another. The first one is the prevalent one, that interprets the period as a long moment of socioeconomical depression, I could say. The other, instead, stresses that this brusque demographic drop brought to an overall improvement of the relation between population and resources, which had become unsustainable in the early 14th century, let's say. The plague would have thus acted as a sort of re-equilibrating factor. I disagree with this view. I mean, I know it's correct in the sense that these factors brought to a re-equilibration, but the re-equilibration was not much due just to the possibility, let's say, to a redistribution of wealth per se. This is what I would like to stress, that it wasn't much a re-equilibrating factor in relative terms. As a matter of fact, this was the moment in which resources were controlled by ever fewer people that surely knew how to employ them in a kind of more considered fashion. What had happened by the early 14th century is that the system had developed in an unregulated way. There were more competitors with the limit, let's say the overexpansion, especially from a demographic point of view, probably, but also because of this continuous instability that had eroded gradually, saying resources. The system had to implode. The people had to fight over resources in ways that had never been seen before. And when we talk about resources, we're talking about properly the political and social interests, right? Not much the production structures per se, or how how the view of power was conceived in a kind of an economical way compared to another, right? The means were dramatically homogeneous. Everybody was basically pursuing the same goal. And even those instances from the lower classes of the population weren't really happening because there was kind of a different way, at least much of a different way in which they were treated, let's say, mechanically, in a sense. Like, the system was working basically in the same way. The point is that the space for political autonomy was shrinking, because who could not stand on its feet was subjugated, and the moment in which was subjugated, it lost basically everything it had, at least in terms of political autonomy in the management of their own resources. And it's not much of this political pressure either that those revolts occurred. Those revolts occurred properly because of the unspeakable amount of poverty that this prolonged struggle had brought to. Right, so the elites already had obviously the means to manage this situation in a more mediated way, through their capitals, through their assets, through simply governmental experience. Those who were below began at that point to realize that there were just too few resources. It wasn't properly even really in the way they were, again, treated per se, but properly there was a shortage of resources in the system, where lots of people were, in a broader frame of economical crisis, didn't know what to do. They assumed ever more rebellistic instances, and thus rebelled, and thus brought to, by the way, further instability that even when it managed to reach some conditions of power, kind of lost it immediately, because it didn't quite know or understand what it had to do with that, or where they could go, because the world simply worked in a different way, and they were just exploiting the situation to find a space for them, but let's say within the system, it was not altered, could not be altered per se. So of course the idea that there was a re-equilibration of resources, but even the demographic fall was not the main cause, in my opinion. Demographic fall happened because, of course, of the plague, that you would think, yes, less people, more resources around, right? Not quite, because, less people also means that the system collapses. So the instability that follows it is a systemic disorder, and banally, even in the population that we know happened, right? There were entire areas that went deserted again, where the forests came back after centuries, etc. Could not bring to an articulated response, especially if these communities now were emerging from already a state like it happened in the last couple of centuries, where they had enjoyed a certain autonomy, but were still, however, under some ferocious elite that had managed from a much greater top, let's say, still what their autonomy had to be about still, because they weren't free, weren't like, there is mostly, even in the contraction of those universal structures, there is a political social compaction somewhere along the main centers of Europe, but in the more peripheral areas were also largely the least, let's say, at least organized initially. It was obvious that it would be revolts. This happened even before the plague. It happened, in fact, in the first half of the 14th century. So, well, the stall, the recession had already kind of started. So some powers began to lose height. Let's say, think about France. Think about, and temporarily, these communities reached some kind of autonomy, even winning it with in arms, right? But if you look at what happened after the plague, still very often this had done due to numbers. Sometimes the Flemish revolts, these things had occurred also because of the importance of the city, of the local trade. As we've seen, those areas instead would lose importance during the 14th century, 15th century, the same time, right? And so refeudalization, these forces were not enough to keep maintaining the system, especially in a non-oligarchic sense themselves. So these are really many factors combined, right? And so we agree that this crisis brought to a settlement of some sort, but the point is that the crisis happened before the demographic fall. The crisis, this destabilization, this consumption of resources happened before the plague. Happened already 20 years before the plague. You can easily see it in how the decrease we were talking about before in the size of armies, in the frequency of military operations, right? It was a greater impoverishment exactly because of these political upheavals had brought to further instability and literally the destruction of entire areas, sometimes the consumption of resources. And the system was not supporting that continuous growth anymore. And so this brought people to grab the least resources that were present there, and so they had to take out each other in the process to make it happen. And of course, the elites were better prepared for this anyway, so that we can speak properly of a refeudalization of the system for this reason, but also the people at large were to accept at some point that new stability rather than thinking of themselves like, okay, we have to be kind of a democracy where everybody is, in power, in charge. How? With which means? With which capacities? With which commitment? In a world that is dramatically poor in the first place, independently from crisis, like who's gonna do that? You needed oligarchies, and that's exactly how things turn. Basically, for all the system, like I can't think of a single system here that even when it reached, like, can it emerge in a rebellistic sense, like these great revolts of the communes or the peasants in the first half of the 14th century, that kind of remained, that went ever to an ever more democratic direction. Of course, it was always the oligarchies rising again, and actually improving in a sense in that way. I mean, think about the Swiss Confederacy, for example, or even the Flemish city-states, Flemish that were, after all, yeah, they had broken free, but it's an oligarchy mostly that increased in representative in political power in the last 2 centuries of the time, because it was a common trend. And there is indeed the coexistence of a great artistical development, such as in fact, humanistic Renaissance one was, and the spread of the plague, that can be explained, let's say, in some ways. Let's say, of course, the consequences were tragic, right? So you can't really say, it was just an artistic, development because the plague had arrived. Even if, people were more emotional, they wanted to express this tension or whatever. The supporters of the optimistic thesis would like to see the general positivity of this phenomenon. So to say, well, yes, 1/3 of the people are dying, and rotting in the street, but so it's positive. It's, look, there's art. They started depicting new stuff. That's cool. Well, that's not really a convincing question. On the contrary, there is not some depressive interpretive wave due to that. At least the possibility of seeing that in the humanistic and Renaissance revival, of course, there was an elitistic revival that corresponded to the oligarchization of the system. That is to say, art was a way to invest productively the capitals in a moment of crisis. Why do you think Europe is covered in churches? Like, what do you think churches were built for? Right? Yes, there was the spiritual value was greater, and it fit the system, but still, they were a dramatic investment. You don't build something so huge and precious and whatever if there is not properly even a material value to it, together with the spiritual one. And it's all one in this regard. So the thesaurization in art through the financing of pictorial cycles and monumental works is indeed a form of, a way to fix the capitals, to preserve them, and to portray in the sense that they kind of, look, our ruler built this. They have the power, they have the money, they know what they're doing. Look at what new things they're telling us. Look at how secure we feel because they are celebrating, I don't know, their military deeds, the leaders that they hire to safeguard the system, that they live in splendor. People, contrarily to what is commonly believed, people were exactly the poorest people were happy to live under powerful, rich rulers because they felt part of it. As they were, again, they were their clienteles. They weren't some dissociated class alienated from reality that was there just to do nothing. They saw those things as their safe conduct to stability, because in the broader misery of the time, as long as there was somebody so powerful in charge, they knew that was a good place to live in, and people moved there, by the way. And so this is not much a matter of saying we should have a less totalizing interpretational vision to see yes, but you should study really in each place how it was, right? You have to understand the local situation. Of course, yes, you have to. But let's say if you look at and that can help to understand in depth the mechanisms, the functioning mechanisms and the reactions in front of the pandemic and so on. But still, that's not the first thing, right? It's not much of something inspired by that only, by the plague only, or the thing. But it's more than that. It's how the system unbalanced itself and needed to find new balance, and found it and stabilized, right? And surely it passed through a phase of terrible settlement, of continuous struggles and wars that continued throughout the 14th century and beyond, so that this idea of this general mood of the plague never passed. Also, by the way, because the plague did not pass. And that's an important thing to realize, that it went on up to the 18th century. It didn't stop, right? So it was cyclical, it was normal. So of course it was seen as yet another troubling factor, but in existences that were troubled by many other factors, just than that, right? And so if you look at what these factors were, again, look at the histories they wrote at the time, what is that they were actually telling about how the world was going. I think that's particularly relevant. It goes far beyond, let's say, in fact, this is a contingency, and you have to look surely at the context of each situation to find out how the thing really worked. But at the same time, it's not difficult to see how the system contracted, right? Even if it were just from a material point of view, right? It's just that it resettled on something that was immediately and more evidently more stable than before, probably because they didn't have even many other options. Like, if resources are exhausted, what can you factually do about that? Like, where do you find it to do anything else? So it was normally happening in that fashion, and it can't be quite seen in different ways. And this is what we forget, generally speaking, about history, is that very often we say, yeah, they should have done this, they should have done that, it was this guy's fault or this other's. But have you ever thought that, first of all, you know, of course, people at the time knew much better than you what their world was and functioned and decided to live on, by the way, with ridiculous coercive means, considering the what could be done in theoretical terms, in fact what was not done, but that they also wouldn't have quite of a sensible option to do otherwise. And you know, the stripes were there, so those who could attempted that, and they largely failed, but still the elites maintained control, and they did it by creating a system that lasted for some 300 years or more, depending 300, 500 years, depending on the country, and that is a testament still to the fundamental essentials of what those societies fundamentally were, and that didn't have much of another material capacity to invest. I mean, we underestimate literally the poverty of this system. I mean, how few properly the surplus was in those moments, and how few concretely could be done to change the situation, the reality. Every peasant knew more or less what were the options of what could be done or couldn't be done. I presume that's really important to understand. In any case, for today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.